we're gonna get started with a few announcements, and I'll give you the rough run of show. I think you're in for quite a treat tonight. So just welcome on behalf of the Age Boom team. We have Jennifer Ware, who's my partner in planning, and Sam Eichmann is running the tech tonight. Couple of announcements. We sort of, it's a fire hose that's begun. We sent you a note on the social media toolkit. Feel free to use that as much or as little as you please. We're going to drop the link to the Slack channel that you guys requested, or some of you requested last time. And again, no pressure. You don't have to opt in, but if you want, there'll be lots of information dropped in there over the course of the Academy and afterwards. You also have the opportunity to link in with me and then join the Age Boom Fellows alumni group and have access to other people's reporting. And that's where I'll amplify your own reporting, similarly with the Facebook group. So if you have any questions about any of the social media options, feel free to email me or ping me on one of the channels. Sam, will you go ahead and drop the Slack and Twitter information into the chat? The Twitter list, for better or for worse, is a place where you can monitor what you're saying in real time. I don't know if you're familiar with lists, but we've got all your handles in there, and so you can follow each other and amplify each other by joining that, by following that list. I foreshadowed last time the following, but I wanted to thank Juan Pablo Garnham of Eviction Lab, who you're going to hear from in a second, as well as Rich Eisenberg, for creating a style guide for the Academy. Sam's going to put a link to that in the chat. It's a Google Doc, and we hope to co-create this. I invite AJ and Ruth to also take a look. That's a lexicon that we are going to work on together as a group project for terminology to deal with some of the language and the shift in language reporting on some of these issues. And a reminder that we're going to meet a week from tonight, next Wednesday. Tonight is sort of shock and awe, and next Wednesday is the soul of our mixers. We're going to have real people join us. We have a handful of individuals from different perspectives, and we will be sharing a little sort of a bio of each individual, and you'll be able to choose next week 2 breakouts to visit with these people that we've convened who are sort of advocates in their communities, some of whom, have lived experience and they're willing to share with you. And I just wanted to disclose on that, for a couple of them, we will be providing a gift card to acknowledge their lived experience and their time. And I just wanted to be transparent about that to you guys. But they're talking to you on the record. So join us for sure next Wednesday. And if you haven't had a chance, we've got that library of Big But Brief videos. I hope that you saw Odette Williamson's for tonight. If you didn't, take a look. Really important legal entanglements there, technically tangled titles specifically. Really good information about sort of the structural racism in our system, the legal system, and untangling it. So tonight we set the table with a capstone conversation about really difficult societal realities that underpin all of the issues I think that we'll be unpacking around housing. So shortly you're going to hear from actually 4 of our 6 journalists who are going to serve as moderators throughout the Academy. We have Rich and Juan Pablo, I mentioned, Paula, and you haven't met Paula yet, I don't think, but you met Rich and Juan Pablo last week. Paula will kick us off tomorrow for the opening panel at 11 a.m. Eastern. And also with us is Chris Farrell, who will moderate. Sorry, Chris, I don't have it on the top of my tongue what day you're moderating. I can't
Friday morning.
Friday morning, and he's a veteran of Age Boom. He was a fellow, and he's been a moderator for several years. So I think of these people as your ambassadors and your mentors throughout Age Boom. So I'm going to just go ahead and pass to each of them, Sam, maybe you want to highlight all 4 of them and have them do quick intros and tell you what to expect from their breakouts. And we're also going to drop all of their bios in the chat so that you can dig in a little bit. So let's see what I'm just going to randomly go. Rich, I don't know if you're spotlit, but go ahead and introduce yourself.
Be happy to. There I am. Hi, everybody. So as some of you know, I'm a former Age Boom Fellow. I've been helping Caitlin with the program for the past few years, finding speakers, moderating panels, and mentoring fellows. These days, I write the View from Unretirement column for MarketWatch. I write about Medicare for Fortune. I freelance about personal finances and work and retirement and aging for places like Next Avenue and AARP. And I co-host a personal finance podcast for people over 50 called Friends Talk Money. In the breakout room that I'm going to be holding tonight, we're going to talk about federal, state, and local policies that are contributing to the problems of housing for older adults that we're going to be identifying in Age Boom. And we're going to talk about these policies that are helping alleviate some of the problems of housing for older adults too. I'm hoping it's going to be a freewheeling discussion where the purpose is to enhance your reporting. I'm hoping the fellows in the breakout group are going to talk about ways that they've already been including federal, state, and local housing policies affecting aging in the journalism they've done and how they expected to include them in pieces coming out of Age Boom so we can hear a little bit from each other about what we've been up to. But I also want to hear about the obstacles that you face trying to get information or interviews about federal, state, and local policies about housing and older adults, because sometimes it's not easy to get that information. And how have you dealt with them? Or if they've actually kept you from doing pieces that you want to do because you couldn't get the information you wanted, or you couldn't speak to the people you want to. I'm hoping the last thing I'm hoping for the breakout is that you're going to get ideas from each other about ways that you can add context of federal, state, and local housing policies into the reporting that you're doing to give a sense of public policy as part of the problems that we're focusing in on Age Boom. And that's what I'm going to be doing later. Thanks.
Juan Pablo.
Hi, everyone. My name is Juan Pablo Garnam. I'm a journalist originally from Chile. And I work as communications and policy manager for Eviction Lab, which is a housing research center based in Princeton. I'm super excited to meet you all. In my group, we're going to talk about the effects of cumulative disadvantage on housing options. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you've seen in your reporting, what I've seen from the data that we have in the lab, and kind of like similarly to what Richard was saying, the idea is to share experiences, also talk about the barriers that we have in reporting on these issues and try to see if we can all together kind of learn from each other's experiences and find ways in which we can solve questions, problems, challenges, and related to reporting these issues. So yeah.
Paula.
Right. Hi all. Happy to be with you. I teach at Columbia Journalism School, which co-sponsors Age Boom. And I have been writing the New York Times New Old Age column since, I think, 2009. I currently have a book contract to write about octogenarians, which I'm tentatively calling the 9th decade. I might recruit you all to help me find people. But in our breakout room tonight, we're going to talk about reporting on individuals and their stories. And I would like to hear from fellows about, first, how you find people to highlight in your stories and to use as profile figures. And then also how you approach them in your reporting and your interviewing in ways that might be different from other kinds of folks. These will be mostly the people that we're talking to will have housing problems, right? Most of them, that's why they want to talk to us. They're trying to make things better. How do we they don't know the journalistic conventions. They probably don't know to say, this is off the record. So we might have to adapt our reporting to the particular kinds of people that we're looking for once we find them. So that's it.
Great, thank you. And Chris, if you could quickly introduce yourself, that would be great.
So I'm Chris Farrell, and I'm based in St. Paul with Minnesota Public Radio and Marketplace, and been involved with the Age Boom Academy for a number of years as a fellow starting out, and then participating in various sessions. And I'll be moderating a session on Friday. And probably the two works that are most germane to this whole topic is I wrote a book called Unretirement and another book called Purpose and a Paycheck.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm glad you're here. All right, so next up is the capstone conversation I mentioned. Sam, if you could go ahead and spot AJ and Ruth. I just want to quickly say we're running just a little bit over time, but I don't want to talk long. I just wanted to say that the thinking in programming AJ and Ruth in this conversation was to ground your experience a little bit with the bridge between history and the direct lived experience of people in the stories you're likely to report. So I asked AJ and Ruth to push the boundaries a bit in a somewhat more informal setting, because I always learn from them when they speak. So I am going to hand it quickly over to AJ to start, then Ruth, then they'll have a little conversation, then we'll come for a plenary Q&A, and then we'll break out. So AJ, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you are having a fantastic evening, afternoon, whatever time of day you find yourselves in. I'm happy to gossip with you tonight and very happy to be here with this lovely young lady here. We've been having a ball since I got here, so hopefully you see us giggling. I wanted to start off by rooting you or having you to sort of conceptualize what are your actual underpinning ideas about what housing provides individuals. And then beyond that, what a society is supposed to provide an individual in general. I always like to root this kind of conversation in sort of this justice language, this philosophical, bioethical language, John Locke and so many writers about our social contracts with our society, what we expect to get out of our society. I think at sort of the core value of this, we assume that we pay taxes and we have leaders, lawmakers that then allocate those funds aggregately to the social benefit of us. Because otherwise, what is their purpose, right? Their purpose is to protect us and make sure we live long, healthy lives. So what role do they play in dictating the housing that we then enjoy or not enjoy, that we have access to, not have access to? How do we hold parts or segments of our society then accountable if we have that kind of social contract in mind? Imagine if you don't hold that kind of expectation of your government or the institutions that govern you, right? Then whose responsibility is housing? Is it an individual responsibility? And if so, does that make it a right of everyone? How do things start to shift when you put in the individual sort of responsibility to provide these sort of key things we want out of our society? And once you can see where you sort of sit in that, then we can have a deeper conversation about what we truly expect to see occurring in our lives, what we need to change in order to get to the next stage. And I find that's really the root of some of the problems we have in our society, especially when it comes to racism. There is a disconnect between how people who endure that racism see themselves in relationship to their society versus how society and the governing forces sees its responsibility to every single individual who pays taxes. That disruption is the key to having a conversation about housing. That's my spiel. I'm ready. I'm ready to gossip.
Okay, Ruth.
So I think I'm gonna zoom slightly toward planet Earth, but I'm not gonna get to planet Earth as those of you who know me would expect. So I want you to start by conjuring the images in your mind that happen when I say older adult. And I'm expecting that you've got quite a crowd running around in your mind. AJ and I were talking earlier today about the incredible power of the sense of smell to conjure images, and we both seem like we have that gene. So think about how your grandmother's house smelled, and think about the smells that you think about when you think about older adults. Think about the pictures. Think about the cacophony and the dissonance. I'm trying to get you to appreciate the wide range of states of being that all count as old. And I'm imagining that you've got some images in there that are products of, frankly, ageism. There's a lot of people moving slow in there. You've got some, mavericks sprinting across, running triathlons, And now I want us to ask together, why? Why is that? Why is there such a range? Not just in our heads, but out on the sidewalk why is there such a range of oldness? And I want to introduce a sort of a science word that I guarantee you will never use in your reporting, but I'm going to take it apart, which is cumulative advantage and cumulative disadvantage, which is nothing more or less than the idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer across the life course. We're born into contexts, families, communities, environments with complex, multifaceted identities. And then as we live our lives, in general, on average, those advantages that we enjoyed at birth accumulate, and the disadvantages also do the same. What's going on there? Why is that happening? And there are patterns of difference, of course. This is not random difference. Why is this happening? Are the genes different? Absolutely not. We really know this. Absolutely not. Is this caused so much by people's different behavior? There's a little of that, but there's not nearly enough of that to explain the really big differences that we see, which we can crudely remember by looking at differences in life expectancy, not that that's anywhere close to the whole story. And go back to Gary Burtless's presentation at an Age Boom Academy, a decade ago? Several people on the screen were there for that day, where he showed us that it did not used to be the case that the top quintile and the bottom quintile in income had dramatically different life expectancy. It wasn't true in this country of people born in the 20s. But by the time you get to people born in the 1950s, you've got a 10 and 12-year difference in life expectancy. And that continues to increase. And what was going on? Well, that was the increase in income inequality. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at structured social policies that advantage some people and disadvantage others over and over and over again in the opportunity structures of our lives, from our beginning education to our opportunities for employment, to our opportunities for home ownership, for stable rentership, to live in healthy communities, to live in those healthy ways. And everything that we talk about when it comes to housing policy, we need to ground in the totality of a set of policies that are racist and discriminatory against others who weren't born with everything, and see to it that by the time they die, they have nothing.
Now you know why I invited these two people to kick us off. So Ruth and AJ, I leave you to a conversation. You want to go first, AJ?
I love that spark because it just has so much in it for me. So I like to think of this. So let me just throw myself in, immerse myself in what you just said. So what's coming up first for me is this notion of if you don't already know, how are you supposed to know where the problem is? And I find that that is something that comes up a lot when we're studying structural racism and structural disadvantage. Because if you're not enduring it every day, then it's easy to not know where to start. And our society keeps us all so busy, so distracted, that if you had 5 minutes to think, you'd go, wait, okay, let me understand this. Why don't everyone have this opportunity? This isn't time out. Let's think about this. But we're so busy, we can't even pause to pose questions. So this is where, for me, the lived experience becomes very important. I have to then listen to the people who have survived these experiences. And that, for me, is the root of everything. What is happening to them? No one knows a system better than someone being oppressed by it. They know the ins and outs, the nooks and crannies, the new rule they created, the new policy that got implemented, the consequence of that policy and that procedure. They are the root of it. So I'm thinking, how do we start this conversation without starting with them? Without starting with the people who survive structural disadvantage, because it's through them we can have a deeper conversation about what the problem is and then how to change it.
Absolutely. And at the same time, I need to call out the people who swim in privilege and therefore
Yes.
don't know it's water. That's exactly, I mean, the fish don't think about water.
Mhm.
And so when we come to housing policy, I believe that we've got a group of people who
Mm.
own homes, which they lucked into or maybe saved into with inherited wealth from, guess what? Their parents owning homes.
Mhm.
But only some people's parents never got to own homes. And so I feel like so much of aging policy is actually depending on the idea that people have homes. Those homes increase in value and really are substitute for actually having a long-term care policy is you're going to sell your house. And what that does is to ensure that those people with no house to sell
Mhm.
will never be adequately cared for in old age, except through the poverty system or at the, and we've got lots of people who report on this, or sort of coming out of the next generation's health and well-being, particularly the next generation of daughters, who take breaks in their work and take breaks in their family's care and take breaks in their well-beings to make up the gaps in a system that's predicated on an opportunity that is fake for some people in the current reality. Doesn't need to be fake, but it is now.
This idea of extracting further from women, who are sort of the core to how families actually become a part of each other. They're wrapped around these individuals that give birth. But the fact that that labor is already something that's exploited in our society and capitalized on, and decision-making from outsiders coming down on women's abilities to actually create life and then make decisions around that life. But then the raising of that life, the creating your own life in a way where you can ensure your longevity, but then the caring for the parents before and the generation before. So the thought that they become what fills in the gap. Oh, it's like, what are we even pulling from? We're already pulling from something that's being overly extracted from. It's almost like monopoly money. Like we're just manufacturing money out of a game that deserves more. So that I never even thought about. I think about the hidden labor force a lot, but I never thought about women as the hidden labor force behind the ability for us to have longevity, for us to have property and land and maintain that over generations. That's wow.
And it's the interconnectedness of the economic realities, the public policy frame, and then who is filling in the deficits. So then it's the emotional and the personal. And then where does that come from? Does it come from the next generation? Like who's getting short change?
Yeah, because someone has to. In this kind of capitalistic system, it's great theoretically, but in practice, it's a pyramid scheme. It's meant to funnel everything from the bottom up. But what happens when the bottom has nothing further, like you've reached the floor? How then does the top keep growing? I feel like that's the stuff of sci-fi. Sci-fi movies and books try to deal with that. It's like, what does it mean for 99% to be on the floor and the rest and the 1% to be in the ceiling? Where do you extract from at that point? I think we're getting to that kind of point when it comes to housing. Well, let's dive into some housing policies and racism and all of you probably are already familiar with this. It's going to be redundant talking about redlining and the practices of the Federal Housing Administration, and really encouraging banks to differentially provide loans, insuring those loans in differential ways so that certain groups were allowed to live in areas and other groups were not. And then, but this becomes a part of that system, why we call it structural racism, because it's not just the housing administration, but then it's the hospitals that get built in those specific neighborhoods. There's a reason all the academic medical centers are in areas with predominantly people racialized as white. They were never built anywhere else. There are no hospitals on the other side of town because no one ever built a hospital on the other side of town. There was a reason for that. It's so that people could actually only attend that hospital, and then within that hospital be mistreated, only receive services in the basement if they receive services at all. So there's a reason for the way we see the neighborhoods that we study today. All of our language on zip codes and census tracts and census blocks, like, they were designed for us. So what does that actually mean when it comes to housing over time if you're set in a historical context where you can't win? It just so happens that the Federal Housing Administration has over time gone above and beyond the call of duty to mistreat certain groups and treat well other groups. But they technically didn't have to. Just the legacy of redlining was enough to impact all of our lives in the present. Those kind of policies are long lasting when they're strategically deployed in these historical moments that we can't outlive.
Okay. And I want to just literally underline can't outlive, because what I guess the thing about aging, or a thing about aging, that I hope I can frame for you is that the way we age depends on how we lived. And so it's actually incredibly difficult to fix aging when people are old. What we need to fix is how we live our lives. And to fix how we live our lives, we have to fix the opportunities that we have in our lives. And what that means about aging policy is that the invention of generational war is one of those distractions that prevents us from understanding that there should be no greater proponent of adequate school funding than older adults, because there is no single better predictor of aging well than having been educated well. There's no better predictor of dementia than quality education. There's no better predictor of lifespan than quality education. So the idea that I don't want old people living in my town because then they'll vote against the school bonds is the kind of false narrative that has certain presidential candidates that will be nameless championed as union fans. I mean, it's simply a converse, inverse, false way to understand the reality of the world. And I believe that as educators and as researchers and as reporters, we have a responsibility to start to report on the real world,
Yes.
not the ideological world. And to do that, we have to ground in real people. We have to ground in the real people who make the rules, who break the rules, and for whom the rules are made to never work.
Mhm. Yeah, there's no greater understanding of the role of education when you have wealthy people conniving to get their children into great quality schools. It's like, that should be enough. I mean, don't they have the houses and the wealth to set their children up? But no, they gotta connive on the test scores to make sure their kids walk away with the degrees. There's no greater evidence of the power of education than that.
So I think that's a good place to open it up for some questions. There are a couple in the chat already. I think maybe the best way to handle this is the raised hand function. And I know that Rich Eisenberg already put a question in the chat, so maybe I'll pass to you while others are thinking about what kinds of questions they might like to ask. Rich?
Sure. Thanks. Hi, AJ, Ruth. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about people who start in the middle class, or even upper income, but then because of things that happen or things they do, drop to lower income. A little bit about why and how that happens, but also, are housing policies adapted for that experience?
So I'll speak specifically for people racialized as Black because there's a very unique experience that happens here where I grew up with this joke that, do you want to be rich or wealthy? Because being rich means you can be upper class and lose that amount of money and have an experience that we would deem sort of poor or working class. But if you're wealthy, that's not possible. And so when we look at the figures, we see that there are fewer Black families that are passing down the kind of wealth where if one individual's behaviors weren't the best, they could actually have an impact on the family's wealth. But that is by historical design. We have more individuals through education who are able to obtain these upper middle class statuses, and then in one generation be able to lose it all. This is sort of the power of structural racism. I think of it in two ways. Structural racism either inflicts violence on people or it limits their access to life-sustaining resources. So when you have a housing situation where they're marketing subpar loans to individuals, I mean, actually targeting Black families to get these sort of predatory loans, you have a situation where you might have a steep incline in some kind of wealth through these assets, but the second that you have an economic crisis, then you can fall belly up in this equity. But that's a structural hit, right? There's no reason why these individuals that we would deem made it through education, through having these jobs, would be the first to lose their homes in an economic crisis. That's when you have to ask deeper questions, like why them of all the people? Why would they be the ones to fall? And for me, behind it is some kind of structural impact, some violent act that was targeted to that group of people that then allowed them not to really reap the benefits of having a home.
Thank you.
And I want to say a really different thing, which is I want to thank you for flagging not to be overly deterministic in this talking about averages and talking about patterns. I think that your question flags the fact that our destiny is not determined from our birth. It's just a strong probability. And that in fact, all sorts of things disrupt people's trajectories. People's actions disrupt, disasters disrupt, financial, housing market crashes disrupt, business cycles disrupt, and sickness disrupts, tragedy disrupts. And so I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking in big, broad generalities about averages, which hold and in fact increase, but they're by no means predictive of individual stories.
Thank you.
I want to just plug once again Odette Williamson's Big But Brief. It's a diptych with this conversation. Really important policy questions there, and I would be interested in hearing from fellows in the room if they've been reporting in the Midwest or in Illinois about tangled titles and heirs property, and how those really, like with redlining, those really hew to a structurally racist system, and can talk to people being behind the ball and then even further behind. So I plant that in the plenary for anyone who might have experience reporting on that. And I want to call, first I'm going to call on Anne Marie and then on Aisha. So Anne Marie, please.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I was wondering if there was anything you saw during the pandemic that was a response or an assistance or a support. I'm thinking, the child tax credit change was profound for families. And I'm wondering if there's anything for the older folks. We had eviction moratoriums, but those are gone. We had this brief moment, I think, where people understood that some kind of help could really lift people out of poverty. But was there something for the other end of the lifespan that you think was really great and should stick around?
I'll go first with a number of sort of technical things. The first was actually funding flexibility. So there are a number of categorical programs that can be used for multiple different purposes. And the feds and then states and then counties are ridiculously prescriptive about, you can use 15% of it for this and 6% of it for that and 4% for the. And one of the first things that they did in the pandemic was to release all those restrictions. A small difference, cost neutral, that mirrors, of all places, good public policy in Texas, that has during disasters, when a disaster is declared, and I want to actually call your mind to think about the relationships between all the things we're talking about and climate disaster, because all the things that we're talking about, people are more vulnerable in those. But anyway, I remember my train of thought. Where when a disaster's been declared, funding categories are lifted. So essentially they're saying you're a service provider funded publicly by the state, do whatever you need with the money to keep people safe or get people safe again. And in essence, lifting those restrictions did that. The second thing I'll call out is the expansion in telemedicine and telehealth, a thing that was useful to a wide range of populations, older adults included, and rural communities centrally. And some of you are thinking immediately, but old people can't use telehealth. And the fact is that there were stunning experiences discovering that if taught and helped, yeah, they could. So it actually expanded people's worlds because there was much more investment into older people learning technology and have gone on to keep technology in their lives. So I would say that that's a positive. and then I won't go to mutual aid because I've probably talked too long.
You know, I think none of them. But I will say, I will say that note that things do trickle down. So for some families in this country that have always been multi-generational households, those eviction moratoriums, although they were not tailored to people of a certain age, they have trickle down effects when you have a multi-generational household. So the same things that impact everyone else, or even it's their caregiver, right? I've been a caregiver, and so any benefit to me has a benefit to the person I'm offering care for. So all these things benefit, but I will say the problem I always have with them is that we design things in isolation. We treat it like a scientific study, right? Like our own society is some clinical matter we can hold constant. And so we say we'll impact one policy, although all these other policies are impacting the same outcome. We're just going to shift this slightly. And so did we reduce the issues with food allocation and food insecurity? No. Did we bring down the prices of housing? No, we didn't do any of these other things that still impact individuals. We did one small thing and thought that it was going to save the world. And we got to do more. We have to do more multidimensional movement.
Let's go to Aisha next.
Hi, thank you so much. I really value your expertise and everything you've shared. I'm curious to know something that, and I don't recall who said it, but that resonated was we are not frame kind of idealism, right? That we want to ground ourselves in the realism of the lived experience. And I'm curious to know how we report these very intricate, or how we frame these very intricate, centuries old challenges like this, like the way that we are living at the intersection of all of these different systemic issues without oversimplifying the solution. For example, just saying, oh, policy change, more funding, the end. Obviously, there are many moving parts, and I'm curious to know how one frames these issues in a very focused way without oversimplifying.
Yeah, this is why I started you in what do you expect your social contract to be? I always root things in either philosophy or history because I have to go back literally to the beginning to understand the present. While you can tell the truth, I mean, the goal is to tell the truth. I always like to tell the more complete truth I can possibly tell. And for me, that goes back to some kind of historical or philosophical origins. That for me is the way to really hook everyone in. I often think about really what the difference is between Republican and Democratic philosophies of things and how far we've gotten from the actual philosophy of things. But at the root of it, if we had to have that discourse, we would come back to those particular issues. So how can I connect the dots for people? Because they don't see, right? They don't see that they started off wanting states' rights and then now they're in a different kind of conversation, right? So I have to go back to the beginning for them. Like, no, what you really wanted was a lack of persecution. You really wanted to feel like you had power and control over your destiny. How did we get to the place where for you to have power and control had to be at the disadvantage of someone else? And now hundreds of years later, you don't even notice it. You just naturally think for you to come up, you have to stand on someone else. See, for me, that's rooting it back to a philosophical underpinning. I think when you hook people that way, they don't get caught up in sort of the cliche of the conversation. They reorient what really mattered to them. There was a comment here about taxes and school systems. I've always thought that was weird. What do you mean like property tax funds the quality of this? what in the hell? I didn't sign up for that. I always like to think like I need a yearly re-sign up for the Constitution because it's just wild. Like, I just got me in this system I ain't even agreed to. I need to reread it every year and reconsent. This is madness. But what if we thought of it that way, a reconsenting of our ideals in a society, and then pose those kind of questions? Are you okay with walking past someone that doesn't have a home? Are you okay with people not having food? Is that fundamentally what kind of world you want to live in? Did you give your taxes so that you can live in that kind of world? I sure didn't.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Anyone else who has a question, raise your hand. We have about 8 more minutes of this section. So Lillian, can you hear me? You're up next. If you just unmute, please.
Hi, guys. So I hope I'm not throwing off too much or anything, but on the conversation on the structure of things, I guess I'm just going to kind of get right on it. I've only been doing the housing beat for about 3 months. Very big, very large, very intimidating. And, you know, I just started doing like some broad work at first, just reading about some stuff. Turns out the real estate industry is makes more money than oil does globally. Here in the United States alone, it's a $52 trillion industry. Now, of course, then you start thinking, obviously, if you're part of an industry, right, the whole point would be to commodify, right, the real estate and whatnot. And people need to want or need homes, right, in order for that to stay profitable or what, you know, like a business, right, an industry you can keep working on. That said, from what I've noticed, right, like, for example, like here in Florida, people talk about like housing crisis, it's just not enough homes. It's becoming less and less accessible, right, for people to tap into this American dream, right, and own homes, which was supposed to be just kind of natural part of the process. You just do everything right and work. It's just becoming less and less accessible. And when you look at it here in Florida, there's like, I believe, like 70 million empty homes and like 26,000 homeless people. And I don't mean to oversimplify things at all. However, that is about, I believe, like more than 60 houses per homeless person. And my point is, that said, right, I mean, we have like huge swaths of homes being bought, and it's almost like a manufactured crisis. It's what it's seeming like to me. I could be wrong now. That said, because of these structures and the way they work, has reporting on housing and the vulnerable led to any conclusions regarding this, right? Is there a way to speak about this in terms of reality, or does this still need to be contested and sourced? And if so, then what is like the more complete truth that can be told about that, or am I just wrong altogether? And that was, sorry it took so long.
No, you had to tell the complete story. That's fine. My response to that is often what's happening is multiple people are telling a story. And everyone is often telling a story to their own benefit. So there is a story about houselessness and unaffordable housing where people are on the street. That is a real story happening. But you're also right that the reason for that is some level of greed. And so it gets connected to another story, but those individuals aren't telling the story that they're greedy. They're telling the story that, oh my God, like I'm losing money. Government, please help me because I can't find quality tenants to rent. So I'm just going to leave things empty. Like New York is kind of famous for this, for leaving buildings empty. But then getting sort of tax breaks and assistance from the government for those homes that should be going directly to assist individuals who need help staying in this just expensive city. So the question for you becomes, how do you stream the stories together in a way that brings about the real kind of change for people? Because the people who have the money to shift the narrative, they're going to tell their story. And it's going to be a special concoction. And it's going to be on every news channel. But what is your role in reporting the truth? Because it's not a lost cause. It's still a story for many people.
And just to kind of put this in a frame we're used to, we've got a disconnect between whether housing is a right and a need, or whether housing is a commodity. In exactly the same way that we have that disconnect about healthcare.
Yep.
And so then we come right back to where AJ started us, which is what is the social compact that we have bought into.
Because there is another way. We keep acting like we have to follow capitalism in this very way, but we've seen the concessions over time. The fact that you can have government contractors is a concession to the capitalistic system that's only market driven. So now the government is a part of the marketplace. So we can create different variations of this where we go of these essential things, food, housing, like those, health, we need regulated by the government because the market cannot regulate this human right.
And I think that for the next several days, you're going to be talking about market failures and the different strategies that philanthropic, different levels of government, other kinds, some kinds of socially conscious businesses try to make to intervene in this failed market. But I think what we're trying to say is that there's some very structural headwinds mitigating against each of these fixes, no matter how good they are. And some of them are really good. I mean, you are gonna look at some beautiful models of sort of interdependence and reciprocity in meeting people's housing and care needs, and so on. But it's not enough given the macro structure that it's sitting in. And so I think that makes that complex reporting, because of course you want to cover those good ideas and you want to cover real lives that got better. But at the same time, we have to cover the biggest picture.
We said we would touch on interdependency and our obsession with independence, but we don't have time for that. That's a whole other mixer. I would love to do that mixer one day. I'm going to ask Jonathan to have the last word. If we could keep it really tight in turning this around, because I want us to get to the plenaries, but he's been very patient. So Jonathan, why don't you ask the last question?
I don't know for sure how quick this will be or not, but AJ, I think you had made a comment earlier that I just wanted to hear you elaborate on. It was referencing the FHA over time. I think you said going above and beyond the call of duty to mistreat certain groups and treat well the other groups. I could, guess we could all, have our interpretations on what you're talking about, but I'd like to hear from you what you're talking about in particular.
Yeah. So starting with the example of redlining, of deciding that certain groups are backing banks that made the kind of decisions where certain groups could get loans for a home in particular areas. For example, Black people, we call it redlining because the communities they were forced into were sort of red on these maps and seen as hazardous. While there were other color areas where you might have had more integrated areas or places where people racialized as white predominantly lived that were seen as green or ideal areas for those same kind of individuals. So that kind of particular policy or decision to back the Federal Reserve in that kind of banking practice is above and beyond the call of duty, because we already had a situation where post-Reconstruction, we had occupational segregation. So we didn't even have people working the same jobs. And if they were working the same jobs, they weren't earning the same amount of money. So we have wage theft occurring. You're already in a situation where some families cannot afford a home. So I deem it as above and beyond the call of duty to then create a policy where they can't live in certain neighborhoods because too few families could afford this to begin with. And it really end up impacting our middle class growth, our people who came back with the GI Bill, who were trying to cash in on that to have a better economic nest egg after their sacrifice to a country. And FHA said, nah, we're not about your life. We're about maintaining segregation because that maintains the pyramid scheme.
But what policy of FHA are you talking about that specifically created the redlining? I mean, banks certainly redline. There's no question about that. And that's well known. That's the whole root of CRA and HMDA and everything else. But I guess I'm wondering what policy that FHA had, and you're saying something about FHA backing the Federal Reserve.
Yeah. So FHA backs or insures the loans made to some individuals and not others. So that's a particular practice. It's attached to a policy. I could find the name of the policy for you, but you probably could find it faster than I would. But that is a particular action of the FHA to make a decision. They often do this in healthcare too, where they might zone certain healthcare resources to areas, to clinics, and then go, you only have enough for 500 people to receive this benefit. So that's the kind of FHA practice that they employed, where they said, these kinds of loans that come into your bank, we will not insure those. But these other kinds of loans, we will insure them. That's the practice of saying, well, these people racialized as Black, we won't back their loans if they're trying to live in a place outside of the red area. If
Is
they're
that
trying
still
to live in the
happening
yellow
today?
area, the green area, we won't back that loan. However, we will insure the loan at, whatever rate if they stay in the red zone, or if someone racialized as white is in a green area. That's the particular practice.
Okay,
Is that still happening today?
It is.
Is this more? You still see it happening today as much as it did?
I don't know that you would say as much as it did. Often what we say about structural racism is it evolves. So when you have the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which is supposed to prevent this kind of discrimination in particular, often people in housing discrimination will say that it just morphs into a different kind of practice where it might not be about race, but it's still these same geographically outlined areas, like the same areas that have residential segregation in the present are the areas that were redlined in the past. There's a reason they're historically Black neighborhoods, right? So they're still experiencing the same practice, but they're not saying the discrimination is because of race, because legally they cannot.
So this is a great conversation, and I think there's some meta conversation in the chat, Jonathan, that you could refer to as well. And I would like to just take this to the breakouts. I apologize. I know it's frustrating to have conversations cut off and also cut short. Still a lot to say, and I feel like we're abusing everyone's time, but that there's still so much left to discuss about your experiences. So I'm going to tap two fellows for an outro tonight, and I'll stick around at the end if anyone has any questions afterwards. Tatiana Turner and Lisa, if she's still here, who I'm putting on the spot, Lisa Halverstadt, Tatiana, let's go to you just for a 2-minute reflection of tonight's speakers and influenced by your experience reporting.
Absolutely. I was thinking about one thing that jumps to mind is AJ's idea of the more complete truth. It was inspired by Aisha's example. She had a question about how not to simplify reporting. And in my reporting, I cover public housing at city limits in New York City. So the New York City Housing Authority, otherwise known as NYCHA. And a number of apartments at this time are being converted from the public housing and converting to the private market. And what that means for residents, and particularly seniors who, some have lived in their apartments for 30, 40 years, and what that conversion means for them and their families as well. So just it made me think about some of the deeper stories, and is this some NYCHA needs $78.3 billion in capital repair needs, and that's why some of these apartments are being converted so that private management can own them. But it begs a deeper question, like what else? It's more than just a monetary thing, it's humanitarian and other elements as well. So I think the more complete truth is just kind of the huge takeaway that I had for tonight.
Thank you, Tatiana. And thank you so much for your generosity in connecting us through to NYCHA and for your work there. It's really God's work in many ways. Lisa, would you like to have the last word?
Sure. Wow. So I would say I thought a lot about what AJ and Ruth were talking about in terms of the social contract. I write a lot about homelessness, and I run into a lot of homeless seniors. And I think a lot about my two grandpas and how both of them lived in homes and they were able to be supported, as they aged, and then both ended up in nursing homes and received care for, maybe struggles they had using the restroom. One of my grandpas had dementia. I mean, these are very common issues for people that are aging, but for some people, they have a lot less support. And so I also think about this guy named Lester, who I know. He's in his 60s. He's an African-American man. He lives outside of CVS. And he is justice involved. He served time in the past. He's cycling in and out of the hospital all the time. When I've seen him, I've, tried to make sure he has a drink or something. He has a lot of health conditions. He actually went into a shelter, and he ended up having an accident in the shelter because he had cancer and radiation that affected his bowels, and he was kicked out. Well, it turns out that shelter, not only, does somebody who's African-American have more, likelihood of ending up on the street, but there are all these systemic issues that are also in the homeless service system, that are in all of our systems. And it turns out that shelter and that provider that he is in disproportionately exits Black people. And so he's being kicked at multiple levels. And so I really want to report more about, the types of care that might be available to people like Lester. How do we make places like nursing homes available to Lester so that he has the sort of end of life that my grandpa's had? He is no less deserving of that kind of support. And, also for people who may not be on the street, but be struggling, what would it take to have easier access to care that allows them to remain in their homes and they don't have the same kind of family support that others have? That's something else that I want to look at. But I keep sort of reflecting on that part of the conversation, the social contract, the expectations that we have, and how the reality is different for different people.
That's a good place to start for tomorrow. We'll be going there a little bit in Juan Pablo's panel at noon tomorrow Eastern. I think with that, I'd like to thank AJ and Ruth very sincerely for a very thought-provoking conversation, an excellent conversation. I wish we had more time. I will stay, as I said before, but I hope that we can take this forward. We unpacked a lot tonight, and I think it should infuse the entire remainder of the academy insofar as it can. So any logistical questions, people want to remain back, please do, but a huge thank you both to AJ and Ruth, and then to our moderator mentors, Paula, Juan Pablo, Rich, and Rich. Chris, thanks for coming. So we'll see everyone at 11 a.m. Eastern. Come a little bit early. It's gonna be the beginning of a whirlwind.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Anyone stay behind just to ask questions, I'll be here. Good night, everyone.